Thomas Croft thought he had designed the perfect punishment. He took Margaret Holt's home, broke the last brass compass that had belonged to her dead husband, and handed her the deed to a ruined Staffordshire kiln that could barely draw enough air to keep a fire alive. The clay beneath it was worse. Gray, heavy, coarse, so stubborn that local potters refused to touch it. And Croft made sure Margaret could not buy the lead compounds normally used to make ceramic watertight. She had 4 pounds left, 5 sick workers depending on her, and only 6 weeks before London closed its sanitation trials. Her first firing seemed to prove Croft right. 500 bricks came out porous. Then the frost arrived. By morning, they were cracking apart across the yard, one after another, until nearly everything she had paid for lay broken in the mud. Margaret picked up one of the shattered bricks, and instead of seeing failure, she asked a question no one else at Blackpit had thought to ask. What if the broken clay was exactly what the next firing needed? Because, if she was right, the Duke had not given her a worthless kiln. He had given her the material that could destroy his monopoly. Thomas Croft broke the compass against the iron step of his carriage. The brass leg snapped cleanly near the hinge. He looked at the 2 pieces in his gloved hand, then dropped them into the gray Staffordshire mud beside the deed to Blackpit kilns. "Your husband measured everything," he said. It did not save him. Margaret Holt did not answer. Behind Croft stood the property he had transferred to her in settlement of the debt he had refused to extend. Blackpit's bottle kiln rose above the flooded yard, like a damaged chimney stack from an abandoned factory. Its upper crown had collapsed inward. 2 iron fire doors hung crooked on rusted hinges, and rainwater had gathered in the ruts where clay carts once crossed the yard. 5 men waited beneath the lean-to roof. All had worked around Croft's lead interests before sickness or dismissal made them inconvenient. None looked strong enough to waste a week on false hope. Croft glanced toward the kiln. "You have 6 weeks before the London sanitation trial closes. I understand you intend to continue your husband's little argument with the board." Margaret bent and lifted the deed first. Then she picked up both halves of the compass. "You also understand," Croft continued, "that no merchant who values my business will advance you lead compounds on credit." He had chosen the punishment carefully: a pottery without glaze, a furnace that could not draw, a clay pit local manufacturers called too coarse for respectable wear. Margaret slipped the broken compass into her coat pocket. "How much money have you left?" he asked. 4 pounds. For the first time, his mouth moved slightly. The carriage rolled away before she entered the kiln. Inside, the air smelled of wet brick, old ash, and iron scale. Margaret ignored the mud soaking through her boots. She examined the fireboxes, then the cracked door edges. At the rear of the chamber she found fallen refractory brick where the throat narrowed toward the chimney. Elias Reed, the oldest of the 5 workers, followed her in. "It never pulled properly," he said. "Last owner kept feeding coal. Heat stayed low." Margaret crouched beside the collapsed brickwork. She took one broken compass leg from her pocket, laid it against the surviving course, and used a length of packing string to extend the measurement. The kiln shell was damaged, but not ruined. The throat was wrong. Someone had rebuilt it too narrow and too low, choking the upward draft before the chimney had collapsed completely. Outside, she crossed to the clay pit and cut a lump from beneath the wet surface. It was heavy, coarse, and stubborn under her thumb. A potter would have cursed it. Margaret turned it once in her palm. After weeks of spring rain, the exposed wall of the pit had barely softened. She looked back at the dead kiln. Croft had given her clay that resisted water and a furnace that could no longer reach the heat required to change it. One of those facts was supposed to make the other useless. Margaret was no longer certain that it did. By noon, Margaret had divided Blackpit into what had failed and what had merely been neglected. The difference mattered. She sent 2 men to clear fallen brick from the chimney throat, while Elias Reed removed the worst iron scale from the fire doors. Margaret worked at the clay pit. She cut samples from the exposed wall, then from a harder layer 2 feet below it, labeling each with chalk marks on broken roofing slate. The upper clay softened slightly in water. The deeper material barely yielded beneath her thumb. When she rolled a piece between her palms, It resisted every attempt to make a fine coil. Too coarse for delicate ware, too stubborn for a teacup. That was what the local potters had seen. Margaret saw something else. She dried 3 small blocks beside a brazier, scratched them with the broken brass compass leg, then struck one against a surviving firebrick from the kiln lining. The clay contained grit, but the body held together. More important, it showed little of the soft collapse she expected from common earthen clay after days of rain. This material did not want to be shaped thin, it wanted mass. Elias came from the kiln, carrying a blackened brick. "Found 3 courses like this behind the fall," he said. Margaret scraped the surface clean. The brick was dense, pale, and built for severe heat. The old furnace was meant to burn hotter than the last owner managed. He burned twice the coal and still never got there, because he was feeding a chimney that could not breathe. She took a string line into the chamber and measured the surviving throat against the dimensions on her husband's old sectional drawing. Someone had patched the passage years earlier, narrowing the opening and lowering one side. The later chimney collapse had made the defect obvious, but the kiln had been choking long before that. Repairing it was possible. Paying for the repair was another matter. They walked the rear boundary before dusk, searching for usable brick. Beyond a wall of thorn and nettle, Margaret found rotten timbers descending toward a strip of dark water. An old loading bank stood there, half collapsed into the mud. Elias pushed weeds aside with his boot. "Canal branch," he said. "Used to bring coal in, clay out." Margaret looked from the water to the kiln chimney above the yard. A furnace, built for high heat, clay that resisted water, a forgotten route meant for heavy cargo. Blackpit had not been worthless when Croft handed it to her. It had been misunderstood. Then Elias asked the question that reduced all 3 discoveries to arithmetic. "How much coal can 4 pounds buy?" Margaret spread her husband's kiln, drawing across an upturned packing crate, and held the corners down with 4 lumps of coal. The section lines were familiar. She had copied them often enough during his trials that she could still remember which figures he had revised after the 3rd firing and which after the 7th. She had not merely watched those experiments. She had measured shrinkage, recorded firing color, shifted firebrick baffles, and stood beside the furnace while he argued that clay changed only when heat, air, and time were forced into the correct relationship. Blackpit's clay needed more heat than Margaret could presently afford. That was the problem. A proper rebuild of the throat would take brick, ironwork, and labor. A full high-temperature firing would consume coal she did not have. The 5 men could live on promises for perhaps a day. Their families could not. So Margaret made the first decision she distrusted. She drew 3 lines on a slate. First, patch the chimney throat only enough to restore partial draft. Second, press the gray clay into thick floor bricks instead of attempting fine pottery. Third, fire them at a lower temperature, sell them quickly to local builders, and use the money to rebuild Blackpit correctly. Elias read the slate. "You said the clay wants more heat." "It does, and we are giving it less. We are giving it what we can pay for." That afternoon, Margaret sold her silver-backed hairbrush and the last decent shawl she owned. The money bought coal, lamp oil, coarse meal, and enough second-hand firebrick to close the worst gap in the throat. She kept the 4 original pounds untouched until the coal cart arrived. Then, she counted the coins into the merchant's palm, one at a time. By evening, the men had repaired the kiln as far as the money allowed, not as far as Margaret wanted. They pressed the first bricks in heavy wooden frames. The clay fought every stroke of the lever. It dragged at the mold edges and left rough surfaces that no maker of tableware would have accepted. Margaret approved them anyway. They did not need beauty. They needed something a builder would buy by the hundred. Before loading the kiln, she checked the patched throat once more. The passage was still too low on the eastern side. The draft would be uneven. She knew it. Elias knew she knew it. "We can stop," he said. Margaret looked at the coal pile, then at the men waiting for wages. "If we stop, we cannot afford to begin again." At dusk, she closed the iron doors and ordered the fire lit. The flame rose slowly through Blackpit for the first time in years. Margaret watched the smoke at the chimney. It climbed. Then, almost imperceptibly, it curled back. The kiln failed exactly where Margaret had expected it to fail, only worse. By midnight, the flame had begun folding back through the lower chamber. Smoke leaked around the warped eastern door. Elias packed the gap with wet clay while two men fed coal, but every correction cost heat somewhere else. The fire brightened near the boxes and died toward the crown. Margaret checked the color through the spy opening until her eyes watered from smoke. It never reached the heat the clay required. At dawn, she ordered the firing stopped. The bricks came out dull and heavy. Their surfaces looked finished from a distance, but when Margaret struck two together, they answered with a flat, dead sound. She broke one open. The center was pale and porous. They had spent a week of labor, and nearly all the coal to make 500 bricks that could drink water. A builder would discover the defect after the first hard frost. Margaret refused to sell them. That night, the temperature dropped. By morning, Blackpit sounded like dry twigs snapping in an empty room. Crack, then another, then dozens. Water trapped inside the porous bodies had frozen and expanded. Hairline fractures widened across the stacked bricks. Corners split away. Some pieces burst apart where the wet clay had held the most moisture. Elias stood beside the ruined batch with both hands black from coal dust. "That is all of it," he said. Margaret picked up a fractured brick. "No." She turned the broken face toward the light. The fired clay had failed as a finished product, but it had already survived one heating cycle. It would no longer shrink like raw clay. She carried the piece to the workbench and struck it with a hammer. Once, twice. The brick broke into hard, angular grains, crushed the whole batch. One of the younger men stared at her. For what? To put it back into the clay. They worked through the afternoon with hammers, iron rammers, and a stone trough, sorting the fragments by size. Margaret mixed the crushed material into fresh gray fire clay and watched the change immediately. The mass was still heavy, but the grog interrupted the wet clay body like a rigid skeleton. It resisted sagging. It released from the wooden mold more cleanly. Using a lever press, they forced the mixture around a cylindrical core and formed a short, thick pipe section. No wheel, no delicate throwing. Industrial clay needed pressure. When they lifted the wooden frame away, the pipe held its shape. Margaret measured the wall with one broken leg of the brass compass. Then she walked back to the kiln. The first firing had proved that patching the chimney halfway was more expensive than repairing it correctly. This time, there would be no compromise. She and Elias climbed the scaffold themselves. They pulled out the narrowed brick courses, rebuilt the throat to the proportions on her husband's section drawing, and reset the passage so the rising gases would meet the chimney cleanly instead of curling backward into the chamber. By dusk, Margaret stood beneath the rebuilt draft and felt cold air moving past her hand toward the flue. Not much, but enough to lift dust from her palm. The kiln could breathe again. Now they had to find out whether it could burn hot enough to turn the coarse gray clay into stone. The rebuilt kiln pulled differently from the first hour. Flame no longer rolled back through the lower chamber. It rose. Margaret had the men stack the first pipe bodies on refractory spacers, leaving narrow channels between them, so heat could travel around the walls, instead of striking one side and dying against the next. The pieces were thick, grog-stiffened, and ugly by pottery standards. That suited her. Blackpit was no longer trying to make pottery. It was trying to make something that could survive underground. By the second night, the iron doors had begun to glow at their edges. Elias packed every new leak with clay, while the others fed coal in measured turns. Margaret watched the firing color through the spy hole, comparing it with the progression she remembered from her husband's trials. Red became orange. Orange went yellow. Then the interior became too bright to look at for more than seconds. White heat. Margaret waited. If she added the salt too soon, the surface would not form correctly. Too late, and the firing would waste coal they could not replace. She raised one hand. Now. Elias drove a shovel of coarse rock salt directly into the firebox. The reaction was immediate. Salt snapped against the heat and vanished into a dense white vapor. Another shovelful followed, then another. The furnace hissed and crackled as the vapor swept through the chamber around the incandescent pipes. Sodium-bearing gases met the silica in the clay surface, forming a glassy skin while the ware was still inside the fire. Harsh chloride fumes pulled upward through the restored chimney with the draft. No lead. No glaze bucket. The furnace made the surface itself. They sealed the doors and let Blackpit cool slowly. When Margaret opened the kiln the following day, she rejected the first pipe she touched. Its collar had warped. The second had a hairline crack. The third did not. Its surface had turned brown with mottled orange patches, slightly rough like citrus peel beneath a clear glass sheen. Margaret lifted it onto the bench. Elias struck it lightly with an iron key. The pipe rang, not the dull knock of the frozen bricks. A clean, metallic note. They filled 3 lengths with water and left them standing overnight. The floor beneath them remained dry. Within 4 days, a nearby chemical works agreed to test several sections against corrosive liquid that had damaged ordinary fittings. After the trial, the manager returned to Blackpit and placed money on Margaret's bench. "I'll take 10. Margaret counted the payment before answering. It was enough for tons of coal. Across the yard, the kiln stood black and cooling above stacks of finished pipe. For the first time, Blackpit had produced something an independent customer had tested, trusted, and paid for. And before the coal order reached the yard, word of that purchase had already reached Thomas Croft. Margaret did not celebrate the chemical works order. She cut one of the paid pipes in half. The saw took longer than expected. When the section finally opened, the wall showed what she needed to see. A dense fired body beneath the salt-glazed surface, far tighter than the pale center of the failed bricks. She placed it beside a rejected pipe and began measuring. Water absorption first, then wall thickness, then shrinkage from mold to firing, then pressure. Elias built a crude testing frame from timber, iron straps, and fittings borrowed from the chemical works. They sealed short pipe sections, increased the water pressure in stages, and marked every leak with chalk. The first collar failed. The second held longer but cracked, where the wall had dried unevenly. Margaret changed the mixture. She reduced the largest grog particles around the collar, increased drying time, and thickened the transition between the socket and the pipe body. The next firing produced fewer usable pieces, not more. Coal had been spent on a lesson, but the surviving lengths held pressure beyond anything their first batch had managed. A sanitary engineer named Samuel Pike arrived 3 days later carrying notes from work he had once discussed with Margaret's husband. He did not congratulate her. He asked for her worst pipe. Margaret gave him 2. Pike examined the porous fracture of one reject, then ran a finger over the glazed interior of a successful length. "Your husband wanted fewer joints and less seepage," he said. "He wanted materials that stayed what they were after burial." Pike looked toward the stacks cooling beside the kiln. "This may matter more than chemical works." He explained the problem without romance. Sanitation lines failed where materials absorbed waste, where joints leaked into surrounding soil, and where rough interiors collected deposits. Blackpit's pipe offered something different: a vitrified body, a hard glazed surface, and enough thickness to survive heavy use if Margaret could hold dimensions from firing to firing. One good pipe was irrelevant. 1,000 consistent ones were valuable. That evening, Margaret had 2 choices. The chemical works wanted another small order and would pay quickly. She could keep Blackpit alive by serving factories that needed corrosion-resistant pipe, or she could spend nearly all of that new coal producing full-size sanitation lengths before London's submission window closed. Elias waited while she studied the firing ledger. "How many days?" 18. "And if London says no, we still know how to make pipe." Margaret turned the ledger to a clean page. She wrote 3 headings: body mix, firing, rejects. From that moment, every pipe leaving Blackpit would be measured, marked, and either approved or broken. No warped collar would be hidden in a shipment. No cracked length would be sold to preserve cash. If London was going to judge Blackpit, Margaret intended to give them more than a miracle from one successful kiln. She intended to give them a process. By the end of the week, the yard was filling with brown salt-glazed pipe, and Thomas Croft had begun asking how much each wagon weighed. Blackpit's problem was no longer whether it could make pipe. It was where to put it. Margaret divided the yard into 4 marked areas: raw clay, drying stock, fired stock, and rejects. Every approved length received a chalk mark after its collar, wall, and glaze were checked. Anything warped beyond tolerance was broken for grog before a buyer could mistake it for finished goods. The work became repetitive only on the surface. 1 man prepared clay, 2 operated the heavy wooden presses. Elias supervised stacking and firing. Margaret moved between all of them with the ledger under one arm, watching moisture, wall thickness, drying time, and coal consumption. The second full firing produced 83 approved lengths. The third produced 112. The men were paid in cash on Saturday. That changed the yard more than any speech could have. 2 former miners brought younger brothers looking for work. A widow from the nearby village asked whether Blackpit needed someone to sort packing straw. The chemical works placed another order. Then the first revised toll notice arrived. Heavy ceramic freight, passing through the Western Turnpike, would now be charged at a rate nearly 3 times what Margaret had budgeted. She recalculated. The profit disappeared. The following day, a carrier who had agreed to take 40 lengths toward London returned her deposit. "Can't risk losing Croft's contracts," he said. Another demanded double his previous rate. A coal wagon failed to arrive at all. Margaret pinned the toll notice beside her freight figures and worked the numbers again. She could reduce wall thickness and lighten each load. She rejected the idea immediately. The pipe had earned its value because it was dense, thick, and consistent. Saving freight by weakening the product would give Croft the failure he expected. Instead, she changed the yard. Finished pipe was stacked closer to the gate. Coal use was rationed by firing schedule. Drying racks were extended beneath salvaged roofing, so no batch would be rushed merely because storage was full. Production continued. So did the accumulation. Within 10 days, hundreds of brown salt-glazed lengths stood in ordered rows across Blackpit, each one tested, marked, and almost useless until someone could move it south. Elias joined Margaret beside the gate as another empty road carrier passed without turning in. "He does not need to close us," he said. Margaret looked over the inventory. "No, he only has to make every mile cost more than the pipe." Beyond the ruined rear wall, weeds moved along the old canal bank. Margaret looked at them for several seconds. Then a wagon wheel cracked somewhere outside the yard. The sound came sharp and wooden through the afternoon air. And this time, it had not broken by accident. The first London wagon overturned less than 3 miles from Blackpit. Margaret reached the ditch before the horses had been cut free. One rear wheel had lost 3 spokes at once. The axle had twisted under the load, throwing the wagon sideways into the bank. Stoneware pipe lay broken across the road in brown, glazed fragments. Collars split, bodies crushed beneath one another. The driver, old Joseph Bell, was still conscious. His leg was not straight. Margaret knelt beside him, checked that he was breathing freely, then sent Elias for the village surgeon and ordered the remaining wagons back to Blackpit. No one argued. By sunset, they had counted 147 destroyed lengths. The surgeon's fee came from the money Margaret had reserved for coal. The next morning, the coal merchant sent word that his wagons would not pass the turnpike under the new charges. Blackpit's fires went out. For the first time since the successful firing, the bottle kiln stood cold. Margaret spent the morning counting what remained, not what had been lost. Approved pipe. Enough for the London trial. Packing straw. Barely enough. Cash. Almost none. Time before submissions closed. 48 hours. Elias found her at the loading yard with the freight ledger open on a barrel. "If we hire another road carrier, Croft will know before the horses leave." Margaret looked toward the rows of finished pipe, then toward the rear boundary. The old loading bank was almost invisible behind nettles and collapsed timber. She closed the ledger. They had inspected it weeks earlier and dismissed it because Blackpit had no money, no boat, and no reason to move cargo by water. Now the road was the one thing they could not use. Elias followed her through the weeds. The canal branch was narrow but open. Brown water moved slowly beneath the broken edge of the quay. "Can it take this weight?" Margaret asked. more than a wagon ever could. By noon, Blackpit had stopped behaving like a pottery. Every available hand was clearing the bank. They cut back thorn, hauled rotten boards away, and laid salvaged timbers across the mud to create a temporary loading platform. Margaret sent one man to find narrowboat owners willing to carry heavy freight south without asking Croft's permission. The price consumed almost everything she had left. She paid it. By darkness, 2 flat-bottomed boats were tied below the yard. Each pipe was wrapped in straw and lowered by rope sling into the hold. No throwing, no stacking by guesswork. Margaret counted every length as it disappeared below the gunwale. The kiln remained cold behind them. The road remained empty. Before dawn, the first boat pushed away from Blackpit. Croft had calculated the weight of her cargo correctly. He had simply assumed weight belonged on wheels. Margaret watched the canal take the load south. Now only time could stop it. Margaret reached London, with less than 3 hours remaining. The canal boats carried more than samples. They carried weight. Blackpit pipe had arrived in quantity despite every road charge Croft had placed between Staffordshire and the city. By the time the first lengths were unloaded beside the testing yard, Margaret's boots were still stained with canal mud. Thomas Croft was already there. He did not approach her. His representatives challenged Blackpit on the point Margaret expected. "One successful furnace proves nothing," one of them said. "Can you supply consistently?" Margaret opened her ledger. She had brought pipes from 3 separate firings. Each carried its inspection mark. Beside them she placed records of body mixture, drying time, firing results, rejected lengths, coal use, and finished output. Then she stepped back. The engineers did the arguing for her. Pipe sections were sealed and subjected to increasing water pressure. One Blackpit collar leaked and was rejected. The next held, then another. Samples were weighed, soaked, and examined for absorption. Glazed interiors were inspected for cracks and rough defects. A representative from the chemical works produced lengths that had already carried corrosive liquid in service and confirmed that the company had paid for them because they had remained usable. Croft watched without moving. The decisive moment came when one engineer requested a pipe Margaret had not selected herself. A worker pulled one at random from the canal shipment. Its diameter matched the recorded tolerance. Its wall was sound. Under pressure, no water appeared along the body. "This was fired when?" the engineer asked. Margaret checked the mark. "3rd production firing." "And there are more from that batch?" 76 approved lengths in this shipment. 31 remained at Blackpit when we departed. That answer changed the room. Blackpit was no longer presenting an invention. It was presenting production. Croft's representative tried one final objection. "Even if the material performs, transport at this weight is commercially absurd." Margaret pointed through the open yard gate. Beyond it, men were still unloading the narrowboats. "The freight cost is in the ledger." The committee examined it. So did Croft. For the first time, his control of the turnpike meant nothing to the calculation. By late afternoon, the decision was entered. Blackpit Kilns received a substantial sanitation pipe order and approval to supply expanded installation trials. It was not a monopoly over London. Margaret did not need one. The contract was large enough to keep her kiln firing, pay her workers, purchase coal in volume, and prove that another supplier could exist. Croft left before the last signatures were dry. Margaret remained to count the pipes the engineers had accepted. 34 tested. 31 passed. 3 rejected. She wrote all 3 failures into the ledger. Outside, the canal boats sat lower in the water after unloading. Croft had failed to stop Blackpit's material from reaching London. Now the committee wanted to know who had used the turnpike system to try. Margaret spent the first payment on Blackpit before she spent a shilling on herself. The damaged chimney crown was rebuilt in proper firebrick. New iron doors replaced the warped plates Elias had patched through 3 desperate firings. The loading bank was strengthened with stone and timber so canal boats could take coal in and finished pipe out without crossing Croft's toll roads. She did not build 10 kilns at once. She built one. Only after it repeated the draft, temperature, and output of the original furnace did she authorize another. Every new worker learned the same sequence. Clay was weighed. Grog was graded. Pipe bodies were pressed under leverage. never shaped as decorative wear. Drying time was marked. Kiln position was recorded. Salt entered the fire only at full heat. Finished lengths were measured, sounded, inspected, and rejected when they failed. The broken ones returned to the crushing trough. Failure remained useful, provided no one hid it. By midsummer, the 5 men who had stood beneath the leaking shed on Margaret's first day were supervising crews of their own. Joseph Bell returned on a stick and refused Margaret's offer of lighter duties. She gave him responsibility for canal loading instead, where judgment mattered more than speed. Blackpit's wages were paid every Saturday. Its pipes left every Monday. Croft's losses came more slowly. The inquiry into the turnpike charges found that toll classifications and carrier pressure had been altered to obstruct a competing manufacturer. His influence over the trust was restricted. Merchants who had once accepted his contracts without negotiation began demanding alternatives. The lead interests did not vanish overnight. They simply stopped being untouchable. One sanitation contract moved elsewhere, then another. Loans secured against expected revenues became harder to renew. Before autumn, Croft sold 2 properties and a share in one of his mines to cover obligations that had once seemed impossible to threaten. He never returned to Blackpit. Margaret did not need him to. On a clear August morning, white vapor streamed above the bottle kilns as another salt firing reached its final stage. Narrowboats waited at the strengthened quay. Rows of honey-brown stoneware pipe cooled beneath the sheds, each one marked for inspection. Margaret stood at the measuring bench wearing a leather apron darkened by heat and clay. Beside her lay a new brass drafting compass. She fitted its points across the mouth of a finished pipe and checked the diameter. The measurement held. She turned the pipe a quarter rotation and measured again, still within tolerance. Margaret wrote the figure into the production sheet, drew one clean approval mark across the line, and pushed the pipe toward the loading crew. Months earlier, Thomas Croft had broken a compass because he believed measurement had failed her husband. Blackpit had proved the opposite. Measurement had survived contempt. And now, so had everything they had built with it.